She had lived in that house for 51 years. 51 years of morning coffee on the same porch, the same creaking floorboard at the top of the stairs, the same view of the oak tree that her late husband had planted the summer they moved in. Eleanor Hargrove had built her life inside those walls, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of patience that most people never learn. And when she died on a Tuesday morning in early October, the world outside barely noticed. But her family, oh, they noticed. They had been waiting, some of them for years. And the moment that phone call came, the one that said Eleanor had passed peacefully in her sleep, hearts simply stopped. Nothing dramatic. Those family members didn't grieve. Not really. What they did was calculate. I want you to understand something before we go any further. This story isn't just about money. It's about what money reveals. Because Eleanor Hargrove spent her entire adult life watching the people around her, really watching them. And she made sure that when her final chapter closed, the truth about each one of them would be written in ink. She just needed a lawyer to deliver the message. Eleanor was born in 1941 in a small town in Virginia. She was the youngest of 4 children, grew up without much, and learned early that kindness and shrewdness weren't opposites. They could live comfortably in the same person if you were intentional about it. She met Robert Hargrove at a church social in 1963. He was an engineer with steady hands and an even steadier temperament. They married within the year, moved to a modest home in Richmond, and began building something together that would take decades to reveal its full size. Robert worked. Eleanor worked alongside him, not in an office, but in the way that people who build lasting things work. She managed their finances with precision. She invested carefully when other families were spending recklessly. She read every contract before signing it, and she asked questions that made lawyers pause and reconsider their assumptions. By the time Robert passed in 2004, what had looked like a comfortable middle-class life from the outside was something considerably different on the inside. Eleanor had quietly, methodically, turned their modest savings into a portfolio that most financial advisors would have envied. And almost no one in the family knew the full extent of it. That was intentional. Here's where I need to pause and give you my honest opinion. I think Eleanor was one of the smartest people in this story, and she hadn't even done anything yet. The decision to keep your financial situation private, especially from family, isn't coldness. It's wisdom. Because the moment people know what you have, they stop seeing you and start seeing an opportunity. Eleanor understood that. She'd watched it happen to neighbors, to friends, to a distant cousin who inherited land, and suddenly found herself surrounded by relatives she hadn't seen in 30 years. Eleanor wasn't going to let that happen to her peace of mind. So she kept quiet. She lived modestly. She drove the same car for 12 years. She cooked her own food and kept her own garden and spent her Friday evenings reading by the window. From the outside, she was just a widow, making ends meet. Now, let's talk about the family. Eleanor and Robert had one son together, Thomas Hargrove, who had grown into a decent enough man, but had made some questionable choices along the way. He'd married twice, accumulated debt he didn't like to discuss, and had developed a habit of showing up at Eleanor's house around the holidays, with his hand somewhere between extended and open. He was never openly greedy. He was the polished kind of greedy, the kind that wraps itself in concern and calls itself love. Mom, I just worry about you living alone in that big house. That's what Thomas would say, and Eleanor would nod and pour him coffee and ask about his children. And later, after he'd gone, she'd write a small note in a journal she kept. She kept that journal for years. Then there were the relatives on Robert's side. Robert had two sisters, Margaret and Diane, who had both outlived their husbands and who had, over time, developed a kind of competitive grief, each one convinced that she had suffered more and therefore deserved more consideration. They called Eleanor regularly, always with love in their voices, always with a story about how difficult things had become, always circling in their gentle way toward the question they never quite asked directly. Eleanor answered their calls with warmth. She sent birthday cards. She remembered their grandchildren's names, and she watched. There was also a niece. Her name was Courtney, and she was the kind of person who made you tired just by being in the same room. Not because she was loud, she was actually quite soft-spoken, but because every conversation with Courtney required you to carry the weight of her expectations. She expected to be remembered. She expected to be appreciated. She had told people on multiple occasions, people who would later repeat it back to Eleanor, that she had always been close with Aunt Eleanor and that she expected Eleanor would do right by her. That phrase, do right by her, is the kind of thing that should disqualify you from any inheritance, in my opinion. The moment you start publicly expecting someone else's money, you've revealed something about your character that can't be unshown. Eleanor knew about Courtney's comments. Of course she did. Small families talk. And every time she heard about something Courtney had said, she made another note in that journal. The last person worth mentioning is a woman named Sandra Pellegrino. She was not a blood relative. She was Eleanor's neighbor, had been for almost 20 years. She was the one who brought Eleanor soup when she had a winter cold. She was the one who drove Eleanor to her doctor's appointments when Eleanor's vision had made driving uncomfortable. She mowed the shared edge of their lawns without being asked and never once mentioned it. She was, by every measure, the least dramatic person in Eleanor's orbit. She would become the most important. Eleanor was diagnosed with a heart condition in the spring before she died. The doctors were careful with their language. They didn't say she was dying exactly, but they outlined a landscape that made the future look shorter than it once had. Eleanor took that information home, sat with it for a week, and then picked up the phone and called her attorney. His name was Walter Simmons. He had handled the Hargroves' legal affairs for almost 15 years. He was the kind of lawyer who wore the same navy suit every time you saw him, who spoke in measured sentences, who never seemed rattled by anything. Eleanor trusted him completely, and that trust was built on evidence. He had never been flashy with her money, never oversold his services, never made her feel that she was an elderly woman who could be managed. She told him what she wanted. He listened. He asked careful questions. And over the course of several meetings that spring and summer, they built a document together, meticulous, specific, and designed to communicate something beyond just the distribution of assets. Eleanor had always believed that a will was more than a legal instrument. She thought of it as a letter, one that she'd been composing in her mind for years. She died on October 7th, quietly, in her sleep. The autopsy confirmed what the doctors had suspected. Her heart had simply reached the end of its particular road. By October 9th, Thomas had already called Walter Simmons twice. By October 12th, Margaret and Diane had each called once, independently, to express their grief and to ask, just out of curiosity, just so they could plan, when the reading of the will might take place. By October 14th, Courtney had posted a tribute on social media describing Eleanor as her second mother, and had included a photo of the two of them from a Christmas gathering 11 years ago. Several of Eleanor's actual friends had seen the post and called each other in quiet disbelief. Only Sandra Pellegrino said nothing publicly. She put flowers on Eleanor's porch. She cried on her own driveway when she thought no one was watching. And she waited to hear from Walter Simmons, not because she expected anything, but because he had called her and asked her to come. The reading was scheduled for October 20th, 13 days after Eleanor's death. Walter Simmons had reserved a conference room at his firm's office, not a large space, but a serious one. Dark wood table, 4 chairs on one side, 2 on the other. A pitcher of water that no one touched. Thomas arrived first. He had put on a suit, a calculated choice, I think, because it announced that he understood this was a formal occasion. But the expression underneath the suit said something different. It said anticipation. It said, I've already done the math. Margaret and Diane arrived together, which made sense, since they were coordinating. They had spoken on the phone 3 times in the previous week. And if you had listened to those calls, you would have heard something that sounded like mourning, but was really negotiation. Which of them had been closer to Eleanor? Which of them had done more? Which of them deserved more consideration? Courtney arrived last, 5 minutes late, wearing all black with the kind of deliberateness that wanted to be noticed. She kissed Margaret on the cheek and squeezed Diane's hand, and told Thomas he looked tired. And then Sandra Pellegrino walked in, and the room shifted. No one said anything rude. They were a family that had learned to perform civility. But the looks exchanged, the slight narrowing of Courtney's eyes, the way Margaret straightened in her seat, the almost imperceptible pause in Thomas's expression. Those said everything. What is she doing here? Walter Simmons came in 30 seconds later, set a leather folder on the table, and sat down. He thanked everyone for coming. He offered his condolences in a sentence that was sincere and short. And then he opened the folder. What happened next, I want you to really pay attention to, because it tells you more about Eleanor Hargrove than anything else in this story. Walter didn't start with the assets. He didn't start with the numbers. He started by reading a letter. Eleanor had written it in July, 4 months before she died. And she had given it to Walter with instructions to read it aloud before anything else. Before the dollar amounts, before the property descriptions, before any of the logistics. She wanted them to understand who she was and what she had seen before they found out what she was leaving behind. To those gathered today, Walter read, his voice level and clear, I want to begin not with what I'm giving you, but with what I know about you. Because I have watched each of you carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of love. Love requires attention. And attention, over a long enough time, reveals the truth about people. The room was quiet in a way that rooms rarely are. I know that some of you called my attorney within 48 hours of my passing. I know that some of you have spoken to others about what you expected to receive. I know that some of you have described our relationship in more generous terms than the reality supported. I know these things not because I am bitter, but because I am honest, and because I wanted to be sure that what I leave behind goes to the right people, for the right reasons. Thomas was looking at the table. Margaret had her hands folded in her lap. Diane's jaw had tightened. Courtney, to her credit, didn't move. She had good posture. I also know, Walter continued, that one person came into this room today without expecting anything. That person drove me to 14 medical appointments over the past 3 years and never mentioned it. That person brought me meals when I was unwell and left before I could thank her. That person never asked what I had or what I planned to do with it. And that is why she is here. Sandra Pellegrino had been looking at her hands. When Walter said that, she looked up. And that's when everything changed. Walter Simmons set the letter down on the table with the same calm he had carried into the room. He did not look up immediately. He gave the words a moment to settle. The way a good lawyer knows when silence is more effective than speech. And in that silence, you could almost hear the calculations inside certain people's heads grinding to a halt, one by one, like machines running out of fuel. Thomas cleared his throat. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a comment. It was just a noise. The kind a person makes when they need to remind themselves that they're still in the room, still relevant, still part of whatever is about to happen. Margaret unfolded and refolded her hands. Diane pressed her lips together so firmly they nearly disappeared. Courtney, seated at the far end of the table, had gone very still. The kind of stillness that isn't peace, but control. Sandra Pellegrino was the only person in that room who looked genuinely confused. Not nervous, not calculating. Confused in the way someone looks when they've walked into a place they're not sure they belong. She had come because Walter called her. She had dressed carefully because she respected the occasion. She had not rehearsed what her face would do when her name was mentioned in Eleanor's letter, because it had never occurred to her that her name would be there at all. That difference, between the people who had rehearsed and the one who hadn't, said everything about Eleanor's judgment. Walter picked up the second document in his folder. This one was longer, printed on heavier paper, and organized in the structured language of legal instruments. He explained briefly, before reading, that Eleanor's estate had been fully assessed and that the numbers he was about to present reflected valuations completed in September, roughly 3 weeks before her death. Eleanor had known. She had sat with Walter and reviewed every line while she was still clear-headed and deliberate. And she had approved each decision the way she had approved every financial decision in her adult life, with complete awareness of what she was doing and exactly why. The estate in total was valued at just over $4.2 million. The room did not gasp. These were people who had trained themselves not to gasp, but something moved through the air. A collective recalibration, a silent adjustment of expectation upward. 4.2 million was not the number any of them had privately assumed. Thomas had guessed somewhere around 800,000, maybe $1 million, if he was being generous with himself. Margaret and Diane had once discussed it in one of their coordinating phone calls, and had landed on probably around 600,000, maybe the house and some savings. Courtney had never named a figure out loud, but she had imagined something meaningful. That was the word she used when she told people what she expected, something meaningful. 4.2 million was considerably more meaningful than any of them had imagined. And here is where I want to stop and say something directly. The fact that Eleanor had accumulated that much wealth without her family knowing is not a mystery. It's a consequence of how she lived. She didn't spend money to make other people feel comfortable about her financial position. She didn't flash it to earn approval or affection. She treated money the way she treated most things, as a private matter between herself and the truth. And I think there's something genuinely admirable about that. We live in a world where people perform wealth constantly, where the appearance of success has become more important than its substance. Eleanor was the opposite of that. She was quietly, privately, profoundly real. Walter began the specific distributions. The house, the one Eleanor had lived in for 51 years, the one with the creaking floorboard and the oak tree in the yard. was to be donated to a local nonprofit that provided transitional housing for women leaving difficult situations. Eleanor had included a note alongside this particular item that Walter read aloud. "This house held me for 51 years. I want it to hold someone else now, someone who needs it more than anyone in this room does." Thomas's expression didn't collapse. It compressed, like something being pushed inward rather than outward. He had assumed the house, not because Eleanor had promised it to him, not because they had ever discussed it, but because he was the son, and sons assume. I've seen this before in other stories, in real families, and it never stops being remarkable to me how often people mistake proximity for entitlement. Being someone's child doesn't mean you've earned what they built. It means you were loved while they built it. Those are different things. The investment portfolio, a mix of index funds, bonds, and a small number of carefully selected individual stocks, was the largest single asset. It was valued at just over $2.9 million. Walter paused before reading who would receive it. That pause was probably only 2 seconds long, but in that room, it felt like something you could measure in heartbeats. "The entirety of the investment portfolio," Walter said, "is to be transferred to the Eleanor and Robert Hargrove Foundation, a charitable organization established in August of this year, with the following mission: to provide educational scholarships for first-generation college students in the Commonwealth of Virginia." He looked up briefly, then back at the page, and continued. "The Foundation's inaugural board of directors will consist of 3 members: Walter Simmons, as legal trustee, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, Eleanor's physician and longtime friend, and Sandra Pellegrino, as community liaison and executive director, with a salary commensurate with the scope of the role." The silence in that room was a different kind than before. Before, the silence had been anticipatory. Now, it was something closer to stunned. The silence of people whose internal narratives have just been interrupted by a reality that doesn't match the story they were telling themselves. Sandra had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her. Her eyes were full, but she wasn't crying. She was the kind of person who holds things until she's alone. I respect that kind of person enormously. Walter continued. To Thomas Hargrove, Eleanor left 2 things. The first was a collection of personal photographs, albums spanning the entirety of her marriage to Robert, Thomas's childhood, family gatherings going back to the 1960s. These were irreplaceable in the truest sense of the word. No monetary value, but the kind of thing that, if you are the right kind of person, means more than any number. The second item was a letter. Private, addressed to Thomas specifically. Sealed, not read aloud. Walter handed it across the table. Thomas took it without speaking. I think about that private letter sometimes. I don't know what was in it. No one does except Thomas. But I have a sense of Eleanor's character by now, and I believe it wasn't cruel. Eleanor wasn't building a weapon. She was completing a conversation, the one she and Thomas had never quite managed to have honestly while she was alive. Whatever was in that envelope, I think it told him the truth about how she saw him. And I think it also told him that she loved him anyway. That's what mothers do, even the ones who were disappointed. To Margaret and Diane, Robert's sisters, the ones who had called within 2 weeks of Eleanor's death and had coordinated their expectations over the phone, Eleanor left a joint bequest of $25,000 to be divided equally between them, with a note that read, "Robert loved you both. I honored that love for 20 years after he was gone. I hope you'll use this to honor something too. It was generous, actually. $25,000 is real money, but it was not what they had imagined. And the distance between what they had imagined and what was written in that document showed on their faces with a clarity that made the room uncomfortable. Margaret asked, very quietly, if there had been a mistake. Walter said, very quietly, that there had not. That exchange took less than 10 seconds. It carried the weight of decades. To Courtney, the niece who had described herself as a second daughter, who had posted the tribute on social media, who had told people she expected Eleanor to do right by her. Eleanor left nothing in terms of money or property. What she left was a book. It was a first edition copy of a novel that had been published in 1962, a book Eleanor had loved since she was a young woman, a book she had read multiple times, a book with her own handwritten notes in the margins. Walter explained that Eleanor had considered this among her most prized personal possessions, and that she was leaving it to Courtney because, in Eleanor's words, Courtney always said she loved reading, and I want to believe her. There is so much in that sentence, so much grace and so much precision at the same time. Eleanor didn't embarrass Courtney with cruelty. She didn't exclude her without reason. She gave her something real, something that meant something, and wrapped it in a phrase that was, depending on how you read it, either a generous assumption or a quiet, permanent verdict. Courtney looked at the book when Walter set it on the table in front of her. She didn't pick it up right away. The remaining liquid assets, approximately $340,000 in savings and checking accounts, were distributed as follows: $100,000 to Eleanor's church, which she had attended for 37 years, $80,000 to a local animal shelter where Eleanor had volunteered before her health made it difficult, $60,000 to a literacy program she had supported anonymously for over a decade, and the remaining $100,000 to Sandra Pellegrino personally, with a note that Walter read without editorial comment. The note said, "Sandra, this is not payment. You can't pay someone for what you gave me. This is simply me refusing to let my gratitude stay silent any longer. Use it however you want. You've earned the right to want things." Sandra put her face in her hands. No one else in the room moved. I need to say something here because I think this moment deserves more than just a description. What Eleanor did with that sentence, "You've earned the right to want things," is one of the most quietly devastating things I've encountered in a story like this. Because she wasn't just giving Sandra money. She was giving her permission. Permission to receive. Permission to acknowledge that she had been generous for years without asking anything in return, and that this generosity was not invisible, was not taken for granted, was not simply absorbed into the universe without being seen. So many people in this world give and give and give, and are never told, plainly, that what they gave mattered. Eleanor made sure Sandra would hear it. She built it into the legal record. She made a lawyer say it out loud in a room. That is not just a will. That is an act of love so specific and so deliberate that it makes me genuinely emotional, and I don't apologize for that. After Walter finished reading, he asked if there were any questions. Thomas said he had one. He wanted to know if there was any provision for contesting the document. Walter explained, in the same measured tone he'd used throughout the entire reading, that Eleanor had anticipated this question. The will had been prepared, witnessed, and notarized with extensive care. Eleanor had also undergone a formal cognitive evaluation in August, 1 month before finalizing the document. specifically to establish that she was of sound mind at the time of drafting. The evaluation had been performed by an independent neurologist and was on file. Any challenge would face an extraordinarily well-prepared defense. Thomas nodded once and said nothing more. Margaret started to say something. Diane touched her arm. Margaret stopped. Courtney picked up the book. What happened in the weeks after that reading revealed again exactly what Eleanor had already revealed about each person. Thomas, to his credit, and I want to give credit where it's due because this story isn't about villains. It's about people. Thomas read his private letter alone in his car in the parking garage below Walter's office, and he sat there for a long time afterward. His assistant later told a mutual friend that Thomas had come back to the office that afternoon quieter than usual, and that he had called his oldest daughter that evening, which he didn't typically do on weekdays, and had spoken to her for almost an hour. I don't know what changed inside him, but something did. And that, I think, is part of what Eleanor was aiming for. Margaret and Diane hired a different lawyer, a brief, flare-like response, who sent a letter to Walter suggesting that Eleanor's relationship with Sandra had been undue influence over an elderly widow. Walter responded with the cognitive evaluation, the records of Sandra's documented caregiving, and a politely worded explanation that the legal threshold for undue influence was considerably higher than proximity and kindness. The case went nowhere. The letter was their last shot, and it missed. Courtney read the book. She didn't tell anyone this at first, but several months later she mentioned it, almost accidentally, in a conversation with a cousin, and said that she had found Eleanor's handwritten notes in the margins and had ended up reading those as carefully as she read the text. She said it felt like talking to Eleanor for the first time. She said she wished she had done it when Eleanor was alive. I believe her. The Eleanor and Robert Hargrove Foundation opened its doors in the following spring. Sandra Pellegrino, who had spent the previous 20 years working a mid-level administrative job and mowing her half of a shared lawn, became its executive director. In the first year, the foundation awarded 11 scholarships. In the second year, 19. By the third year, they had a wait list. Sandra gave an interview to a local paper around the foundation's second anniversary. The reporter asked her what she thought Eleanor had been trying to accomplish. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think she was trying to tell the truth about what matters, about what lasts, about who shows up." She paused again. And I think she trusted that if she told the truth clearly enough, loudly enough, even from the grave, people would hear it. Eleanor Hargrove didn't have a dramatic life. She didn't do anything that would have made the news. She wasn't famous or powerful in any way that the world typically recognizes. She was a woman who paid attention, who kept her promises, who wrote things down, and who built something quietly over a lifetime, and then directed it with extraordinary precision toward the people and the purposes that deserved it. And in doing so, she said something that I think we all need to hear. The way you treat people when there's nothing in it for you is the truest thing about you. Eleanor saw that. She recorded it, and she made sure it counted. That's not just a will, that's a lesson.